So far, Dolly 2 drew up a Cthulhu-themed knife we mocked up at knifeprint.com, who water-jetted these out for us. I paid a graphic artist for this Cthulhu that we lasered onto a piece of steel, then ground and Hamon-quenched our blade. We tried several times to solder copper cladding to our blade with not much success. Then we doctored up our Hamon with lemon juice. Now let's get back to soldering. But why solder? This area, this virtual space between the copper and the steel has to be sealed. Water can't get in here. It'll rust very quickly. So there's not an option for just rivets. You have to do something to seal this up. So it's either epoxy or solder. And epoxy would probably be easier in that regard, but I think solder would be more stable. This area, putting copper here, if we really are going to clad this, it's not possible. It's just not possible without solder. And so I foresee this being a solder operation here. And while I'm soldering that, why not just try to get the rest of it soldered? Because even the sides would be much more stable with solder. What I found with the rivets, when I was trying this, for example, is that even just a little bit of lateral pressure to wiggle this copper around very quickly deforms the holes that the rivets go in, and things loosen up pretty easily. Like rivets by themselves, I mean, I think it would take a lot of riveting to stabilize copper on the side of this by itself. That's just been my experience so far. Maybe I'm wrong. So that's where I'm at. That's why I'm trying all this. Let's see where it goes. This is some peelable mask, solder mask. I'm going to try around some of the edges of some stuff. This is a higher temperature solder paste, and this is a lower temperature solder paste over here. So we're going to cycle through these. All right, let's get our experiment done. I'm going to run through a bunch of attempts to formulate a technique here that's going to work for me. I don't know what I'm doing. If you know how to solder, this is just going to piss you off. You might as well keep moving. So I'm trying to make sure that the solder coats as much of the two surfaces as possible without leaking out the sides. And I'm going to try some various things here. So it seems pretty solid. Let's see if we can drill it and it still hold together. And then I'll try peening on it too, because I want to make sure that it can withstand a little bit of stress, right? I don't want a joint that just fall. Yeah, okay, it just fell apart. There wasn't a lot of good coverage there, so I'm going to put more solder on this piece, but I'm going to use the mask so that it doesn't run out the side. Again, I don't want beads of solder peeking out along the sides of the copper and steel. I want something that looks pretty clean. I think we're sort of onto something. This seemed to work pretty good. There's a little bit of a seam there. There's a little more solder in there than I want. So let's try something. Let's see if we can sweat some solder in place. You guys recommended trying to sweat solder to cover the entire piece. You just put solder on top of one of your pieces, heat the piece, and let the solder disperse itself in a thin layer over the entire surface because it's drawn to the heat. And then you let it cool, press the pieces together, and reheat stuff. Now, I think you have to run the heat from the bottom. I'm running it from the top, and everything's just pooling up, and so I'm clearly doing this incorrectly, or it's just not the right solder. I'm going to try this anyway. And yes, by the way, I am using acetone to clean these pieces before I try to solder them together. I'm just not filming it. All right, let's keep going. Let's keep trying to make a thin joint and a strong joint. See if it can be done. I'm sure it can be done. Let's see if I can figure out how to do it. Yeah, see, that solder just did not run everywhere I wanted it to go. Let's try with the paste. There's a whole bunch of different solders that are good for different things, and I'm just not going to... I could spend hundreds of dollars buying different solders and trying to figure stuff out. And at some point, I just have what I have, and I have to figure it out. I don't have the time or money to, get crazy. So that got nice and hot, some pretty decent coverage, and that one actually held up. So let's try this again. Same sort of methodology, same paste on a bigger piece, and this time we're going to take it to the oven and see if we can go to a very prescribed temperature, not hot enough to ruin the temper on our knife, but hot enough to melt this solder and get us a solid joint. This is 280 degree solder. I'm going to put it in the oven at 45 degrees over its melting temperature for about 15 minutes to make sure it liquefies. It looks okay. I'm not sure it ran everywhere I wanted it to run. I should see a thin slice of silver in there, I think. Yeah, you can see the solder didn't really run. I'm not sure it melted all the way, interestingly enough. Same setup, this time with a torch, so I'm going to get it really hot. Definitely going to make things run. And I just want to satisfy myself again that this technique will work. I just have to get the right temperature. It's pretty tough, man. This is really interesting. I just took these apart with a torch. So I heated them up so they'd slide apart. And they're perfectly sweated. The solder is like perfectly sweated over the surfaces of each of these. I wish I could figure out how to do this without soldering the pieces together and then taking them apart. So again, I'm hoping we can get a similar result in the oven by baking over the melting temperature like last time, but for longer than 15 minutes. We may just have to give things more time to come up to temperature. That's sort of where I'm at. It's just got to work. Okay, I've thought about this. This is 380 degree solder paste. My other paste in the syringes are 280 and I think 450 or something like that. This is a nice middle of the road paste. I can do the finger choil area with this and a torch, and at 380 degrees, I have a less chance of having to heat up things enough to ruin the temper or the heat treat on the blade. At least a less of a chance of doing that than with a 450 degree solder. So I'm going to use this on the choil, and then I'm going to bake the sides with the 280 degree paste, and that temperature in the oven won't be hot enough to loosen this bond. At least I don't think it will. So that's the plan. We're going to try this. Since I don't want to spend a lot of time with the torch, right by the cutting edge, it's very thin steel there, we could ruin the temper. We're going to put the lower temperature solder there, just like an inch or so, and then the rest of that finger choil area is going to be the higher temperature 380 degrees paste that we talked about. That should work. It should work. There's a few gaps in there, so we smeared some extra paste on the sides, and we're going to try to get that to seep down into those creases. We're counting on the remelt temperature being higher than the initial melt temperature on the solder, which turns out to be the case. The spray bottle is to keep this cool while we're grinding off the extra copper on the sides. Last time it got hot enough that it loosened the solder. So we're just going to keep it nice and cool. Go slow. I mean, it worked pretty well. There's still a few gaps in there, but overall, that's a better result than I anticipated. On to the sides now. We're going to use our lower temperature paste, 280 degrees, a nice coating, and this time it's going to go in the oven for a lot longer, 325 degrees, but I'm going to do 45 minutes this time. Everything just needs to get up to temperature, the steel and the copper both. Believe it or not, this looks and feels solid. I think we pulled this off, y'all. That's pretty crazy. That doesn't mean those joints are perfect or that they're gonna, hold up to banging around and stuff. I don't know, but for right now, I mean, all I can say is it feels solid. It looks solid. I mean, I can't believe it actually worked. Looks pretty good right now. There's, that's not exactly the smoothest transition right in there, but it's very heavy. So for this area here, I am going to put a little brass rivet for appearance sake, and maybe it'll help stabilize this area a little bit. And I've been playing around with that. I drove a rivet through here in this copper, and it worked pretty good. I changed the length of the rivet for this piece because that's what I'm going to have to do here. And yeah, I think I got that down. I think it's going to work pretty good. So I'm going to drill the rest of these holes, and it's absolutely hair-raising. I've got a broken drill bit here. So I've been, carefully drilling in from this side, carefully punching it out, and I think I'm about to get it. Golly. Hair-raising. So as we move along, I'm going to add some wear to the copper. This is a sulfur compound you mixed in warm water, and it will patina copper. So I'm going to add some patina to the copper. I haven't decided if I'm going to carry it all the way up to the side of the blade or just on the handle portion of the copper yet. Hey, thanks for watching, and I appreciate everyone's patience. This part of the build took so much longer than I thought. There's hours and hours of footage I didn't even show you guys. Trust me, it was awful. But it's done now. Hopefully we can get on to the next part and get this thing done pretty quick. Y'all take care. Soldering, solder, 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 soldering, solder, 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 solder.